Today is Friday, August the 30th, 2024. And today I want to deal with loyalist defensive fighting and the difference between that and conflict resolution or mediation. And I think that in order to begin this discussion intelligently, that we need to do a history lesson on the Mayflower Compact and how that time in the 1600s changed everything for the natives of North America who live in the central eastern United States. And when I say central eastern, I mean on the coast, not central in terms of the central United States in that time zone. And then after, I want to talk about our judicial system and how it started, because the current judicial systems with courts and all of that is a manifestation of the problems that the Pilgrims on the Mayflower had when they got here and how they felt like they needed to navigate that living amongst the natives here. And as I share the history via these videos I selected from YouTube, I want you to think about how this sort of culminated and the type of people who would need a court system like this. Because for natives, we did have a court system, we still do, but it is relationally based. And that's what I'll talk about after we get through this history lesson. So let's start with that.
Bet you've heard stories about the Mayflower landing. But how exactly did a shipload of lost colonists influence our country's founding fathers? The story begins with a group of English people called the Pilgrims heading across the ocean to a new world for a better life on a ship called the Mayflower. On board were another group of people the Pilgrims called the Strangers, made up of merchants, skilled workers, craftsmen, servants, and even a few orphans.
They were strangers, which means they did not know each other on the journey there, and they still did not feel comfortable that they knew each other well enough once they arrived.
King James I had given them permission to settle in the Virginia colony. But rough seas steered them off course, and they landed in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, well north, more than 200 miles away from their intended destination. The place where the ship anchored had no colony, no English settlement, and no laws. So the Pilgrims and Strangers needed to establish new rules to help them live together and survive.
There would have had to have been some type of conflict that arose that they felt like they needed to come together to make an agreement and then to set some guidelines for how they would live together, because they were in a strange place and had nothing.
They eventually came to an agreement before leaving the ship. We call their agreement the Mayflower Compact. Together, they built a settlement and named it the Plymouth Colony after the English town where they had set sail from months before. Life was hard. More than half of the settlers died that first harsh winter.
Because they had nothing and were in a strange place and did not know how to live on the land, they were also experiencing a tremendous amount of grief.
But within 5 years, the colony was self-sufficient and trading successfully with the Wampanoag tribe.
Keep in mind, the Wampanoags were already here, and they did not bother the colonists as they chose areas to settle and to begin to develop their own places to live. Not only that, given that they could not manage the land on their own and were suffering a great deal of loss, the tribes were willing to help them by finding things to trade. And by the way, what they traded was not money.
So why was the Mayflower Compact so important? Because the document established a self-governing society for the first time in the New World. Even though the Pilgrims were loyal to the King of England, they still made their own rules. And they worked together for the common good. At only around 200 words, it remained the law of the Plymouth colony for 71 years until 1691. And it went on to inspire the Founding Fathers when they created the Declaration of Independence and the framers of the United States Constitution. Why do you think it is important for people to have rules like the Pilgrims did?
Now we're going to look at our judicial system and the powers that have been granted to the judicial system and how witnessing supports that process.
There are three branches of government in the United States: legislative, executive, and judicial. The judicial branch is made up of the Supreme Court and other federal courts whose function is to rule on all matters related to the law and the Constitution. The Supreme Court has enormous power that has continued to grow since its inception in 1789. The first version of the court had only 6 justices. In 1869, that number grew to 9 and has remained that way ever since. Unlike the other branches of government, justices aren't elected. The president nominates Supreme Court members, as well as federal courts of appeals and district court judges. The Senate then has the responsibility to vote and confirm or reject the appointment. Justices don't have term limits. They're able to serve until they die, retire, or are removed by Congress through impeachment and conviction. The Constitution itself doesn't give any specific requirements for who can and cannot be a justice. In fact, federal law doesn't even require a federal judge to be an attorney. But traditionally, most of them have worked as lawyers. And when it comes to the power the Supreme Court wields, the Constitution is, again, pretty vague. Section 1 identifies the Supreme Court as the third branch of government, and it empowers the court to decide cases. That's pretty much it. Section 2 touches on jurisdiction, and Section 3 spells out regulations around treason cases. There is no mention of interpreting the constitutionality of the laws, the very thing the Supreme Court is famous for today. So how did the Supreme Court get that power? The answer is an 1803 Supreme Court case known as Marbury versus Madison. The case is a little complicated, but basically, Chief Justice John Marshall ruled that the law Marbury was using to make his case was unconstitutional. Marshall's ruling established that it was the United States Supreme Court's responsibility to interpret the constitutionality of laws. And so the court's mandate of judicial review was born. And as the highest court in the country, decisions made by the Supreme Court are final. That is, unless a future Supreme Court finds that decision unconstitutional. One well-known example of this was the Supreme Court's ruling in the case of Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Which ruled racial segregation in public schools unconstitutional. This overruled the Supreme Court's 1896 decision in Plessy versus Ferguson, which had legally protected segregation as separate but equal. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, all other courts must follow this precedent. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, all other courts must follow this precedent. When the Supreme Court makes a ruling, all other courts must follow this precedent. Unlike the president or Congress, courts only act if someone brings forward a valid case. And unlike the legislative and executive branches, the judicial branch operates outside of elections and voter input. The judicial branch operates outside of elections and voter input. The judicial branch operates outside of elections and voter input. But it nonetheless has a profound effect on our daily lives by evaluating the constitutionality of laws to keep our government in check.
Now I want to take a moment to look at witnessing and the kinds of witnesses that can show up in a courtroom. There is no audio in the clip that I took from YouTube, so I'll use a bit of music, but I'd like for you to pause the frames to read them if you need to. And if you have not viewed this particular video, I would invite you to do so that you can learn more about my thoughts on witnesses as they relate to Jehovah.
Even if you're not a member of a union, you better thank unions. And what we know is we like hard work.
I now want to go back to LJ's high school world cultures and geography textbook to show you in the index. I tried to use that first, how little focus there is on the judicial system, and there is nothing in here about the Mayflower Compact at all. And then I want to shift over to the Bible, 2 Samuel 20, which is the abbreviated version or this particular passage is the abbreviated version of the entire book of Judith. And here is the introduction page to the book of Judith, which is an apocryphal book, which means it's a book that they use, but they don't want the general population to use. And so it's not included in mainstream Bibles. So I bring these two things up, the textbook and then, which is the Board of Education Bible, and then the Bible, which has been standardized, because I just wanted to briefly make the point of people who want to separate church and state, because they're the same thing. It's just one side is obvious and out and legal, and the other side is, more hidden and secretive. And the result of that is that there is very little accountability in the religious system for the behavior that occurs in those places. So I just want you to understand why the separation of church and state, if that is going to be, it cannot be absence of churches being held accountable in the same way that other types of nonprofit organizations are handled, in terms of taxation, in terms of regulation, in terms of oversight. All of those things need to be in place, because we're still talking about human beings, even though they are teaching spiritual things. And I really hope that makes sense to somebody. And then in verse 18, it says, "Then she said, they used to say in the old days, let them inquire at Abel, and so they would settle a matter." And there's also a scripture on encouraging people to try to resolve issues between them before they have to take them to court. Otherwise, you may see them in court, and then that causes you more problems than if you had tried to resolve it before. And the point is that, a system of justice has to be relational to be functional. It cannot be based on punitive damages. Now, of course, that's the system that we live in, and by all means, I will use it in the way that it is used, because until people are willing to give up this entire governmental system, it's the only way you can hold people fully accountable who think the way the people who came on the Mayflower thought. But the goal of any judicial process should be to bring resolution to any issues that are going to interfere with the relationship between the people who are involved. Because if you don't resolve any issues that are there between the people that are involved, they will harbor resentment towards each other, which can turn into future fighting and ongoing conflict, because they're constantly complaining to other people about what happened and feeling that they were unjustly treated, or somebody stole something from them or whatever. So in terms of witnessing as it relates to traditional Native culture, it's about people being able to come together to work to try to help to resolve the conflict between the two people. So any information or evidence that they provide that might support one or the other and trying to get this resolved, the mindset of all the people involved is we just want them to get along. And, we want to be able to make sure that, both people leave this situation feeling like, they were heard and their issue was addressed. And that's the way it has to be. And if you think about the fact that we've only had this court system since the 1700s, and all of the damage that it's caused, because it is a punitively based system. Either you're going to pay with labor and your time by being incarcerated, or you're going to pay by giving up something that is of economic value to you in order to replace something that you damaged or stole that was of economic value to the other person. It really is not about relationships, which is why you need a judge in the first place. There's a saying that, if you don't raise your kids right and teach them right from wrong, then a judge is going to teach them. Well, that's true on both a spiritual level, but also on a legal level in the society that we live in. Because if your kids won't listen to you, then they fall outside of the internal judicial process of a family, and they end up having to stand before a court of people who don't know them at all and really don't care about them. They, it's just their job. They're getting paid to be there, or they have a vested interest in being there. And then in the case of juries, people usually don't even want to be there. And they don't have a full understanding of the law. They're given instructions about the law and what the law means, and then are told you can only, decide guilty or non-guilty based on these factors and this information. So, they're really constrained in the amount of influence they can have or conversation they can have between the two people who are disputed, and helping them to, come together and be able to resolve their differences so that there are no hard feelings when everybody walks out of the courtroom. I mean, when does that ever happen, really? That people go to court for whatever reason, and then at the end, once a decision has been made and finalized, the people leave the courtroom feeling like they were heard and they have no hard feelings towards each other, even if they decide they don't want to, have anything to do with each other, because, I can forgive you, but that doesn't mean I trust you. So, but you can still walk away and not feel like you have to have revenge, or you have to go back around the judicial system in order to make restitution for something you felt like you didn't, you weren't compensated for, and so forth. And I just really need for people to think about this and hear what I'm saying, because it is directly related to why there is so much lawlessness right now, because of what people focus on. People do not focus on relationships. And I posted this morning this question about, being able to hold in your heart, I will defend this person, regardless of I would defend and protect this person regardless of the cost. And what defending them means to you, because does defending them also mean that you help pull them back or reel them in when they are going in a direction that is going to cause a lot more conflicts than whatever the one is that caused you to feel like you needed to defend them in the first place? And the example I use is, as a big sister, I'm the oldest of my generation. Well, I have a cousin I'm the oldest. I'm the firstborn of my generation in my grandparents' family. And my brother, who is 16 years younger than me, came home one day from kindergarten and was really upset because he struggled once he started school, for whatever reason. He had a lock of hair that I had convinced my mother to let grow from birth. And so this was kindergarten. So this is 5 years of growth. And one of the little girls in the classroom cut it, which devastated me. But whatever. He wasn't going to be able to keep it forever. It was too small. But he came home and he was upset because he essentially described to me that there was a kid in school who had been bullying him. And I was hot. I said, well, tell me what happened. And when he explained to me what happened, it did in fact sound like he had been bullied. And so I was like, well, does this kid live nearby? Does he ride your bus? And he said, yeah, he's at the same bus stop. And I was like, oh, okay. Now I was in college at the time, so I was home for a break or whatever. And I was like, I'm going to the bus stop with you in the morning so I can figure out what's going on here. And in my mind, I visualized this kid that was, twice his size, and, it's elementary school. So, I figured twice his size and just picking on him and, just sort of with a scowly face. And when we got to the bus stop and I said, which boy is it? It was this little teeny boy who had glasses that were thick as Coke bottle bottoms. Who Joey could have taken in size by himself. So it was really more just teasing and emotional and that kind of thing. And so I talked to the little boy, and of course he was terrified because, he knew he had been messing with Joey, and there I was. But I just said, why are you picking on Joey? And, I don't remember what he said, but, I said, but you need to stop doing that because, the two of you are not getting along, and you should be friends, or at least you should be able to be in the same space without, you upsetting each other, and you just need to stop. And he did. He didn't bother Joey anymore after that, and that's all it took. But, I share that with you because, there are people who will be ride or die for somebody. And instead of being willing to hold them accountable, they listen to their story and they buy into it. And then immediately the person who they are antagonistic against it because you are loyal, you decide you're also going to be antagonistic towards that person. And you have no idea what's going on. But on a global issue, isn't that what's happening in Pakistan and with Gaza and Hamas? We don't have any idea. Most of us have no idea of, what's going on there face to face between them. And so as a country, how are you able to evaluate each person individually on their own merit, character, and consistent behavior when you're dealing with a whole country or a whole city of people? So how do you decide, we need to get to these few. And so we're willing to risk and sacrifice the health, safety, and well-being of everybody else because we need to get to these few. Why don't you have enough conflict resolution skills to go in there and figure out what's going on and what each person wants, and to help facilitate that, and to use your weight and your strength to be able to facilitate that, versus going in feeling like you need to fight and kill people because that's the only way you think that the issue will be resolved because you don't agree with what it is they want. But that's the issue, isn't it? You don't agree with what it is they want, because what they want is to be safe, healthy, and happy, and they want the occupation to stop and for you to get out, which is something that doesn't just occur in Israel or Palestine or Arab nations, or in Africa, or in South America, or Colombia, or in Mexico. It occurs everywhere the United States has military presence set up, which are their defensive forces. So the last thing I'll leave you with is this thought about defense and what that means, because we have a Department of Defense, which relates to our military, and then you have a defense side of the legal process. You're either being prosecuted or you're being defended, or you're defending yourself. And just sort of allowing yourself to let those converge and think about this process that everyone has really accepted as okay and decided that they are going to follow it as it is. Because this is where loyalists are critical. You have to have people who are willing to follow these guidelines and these systems blindly to get people incarcerated, or to get people fearful of being incarcerated, because there has to be some level of majority in an area where there are enough people who, if they decide that you are guilty and you need to go to prison, that you have a concern about actually being forced to go and being held there. So, the people who actually send you to jail or prosecute you are not the people who are going to come pick you up. They're not the people who are going to lock you up. They are not the people who are going to maintain you in a locked up status. The same is true for civil cases. You know, the people who are ruling over the case are not the ones who are being accused, and they're not the people who are going to have to pay or are going to receive the payment. So you have to have loyalists who are willing to support continuing the system as it is. And those are the people that have to be dealt with. So this is how my Friday is starting. I hope that you have a good Friday. Those of you who love me, I love you back. And we will see how it goes.